The ground shook violently beneath Jake Morrison's boots as another plasma blast tore through the New Haven colony's main street. The smell of burning metal and melted concrete filled the air. Above them, massive alien ships blocked out the twin suns, casting everything in an eerie red glow from their weapon systems. Everyone into the tunnels. Now! Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the screaming engines of the alien fighters swooping overhead. Families ran past him clutching children and whatever belongings they could carry. A Zolonian mother stumbled, her 4 arms struggling to hold her twin babies. Jake caught her elbow and helped her toward the mine entrance. The Hegemony Coalition had arrived 3 hours ago without warning. Their ships were sleek, black things that moved like predators through space. They'd immediately started firing on anything that looked important: the power station, the communication tower, the main habitat domes. It was clear they weren't here to negotiate or demand surrender. This was extermination. What made it worse was that New Haven wasn't even a military target. Sure, it was a human colony, but half the people living here weren't human at all. There were Zolonians fleeing their homeworld civil war, a small group of crystal-based Lithians whose planet had been strip-mined by corporations, and even some former coalition prisoners who'd escaped and asked for sanctuary. Humans had a reputation across the galaxy for taking in refugees, and New Haven was proof of that. Jake ducked as another explosion rocked the colony. A piece of burning debris crashed where he'd been standing seconds before. The coalition ships were getting closer, their weapons more accurate. They'd figured out where people were hiding and were systematically destroying every building. "Captain Morrison!" A young voice called out. Tommy Chen, barely 18 and one of the colony's communications technicians, was running toward him with a tablet in his hands. His face was streaked with dust and terror. "What is it, Tommy?" Jake asked, still pushing people toward the mine shafts. "The quantum beacon, sir. It's still working somehow. Should I try to send a distress call?" Jake almost said no. What was the point? The nearest human fleet was weeks away, maybe months. By the time help arrived, there'd be nothing left but crater glass and ash. But then he looked at the crowd of refugees, humans, aliens, children who'd never hurt anyone, all depending on him to keep them alive. "Do it," he said. "But not just any distress call. Use the old codes." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Sir, those codes are from the archive system. They're over 200 years old. Nobody uses them anymore. Trust me, son. If anyone's listening, they'll know what those codes mean." The coalition had made a critical error in their intelligence. They'd identified New Haven as a simple mining colony with maybe 1,000 humans. Easy prey. What they didn't realize was that attacking anyone under human protection triggered something much bigger than a local defense force. As Tommy transmitted the ancient distress codes, the signal raced through quantum space faster than light itself. It reached relay stations that had been dormant for decades, communication networks that most people had forgotten existed. The message was simple but carried a weight that made hardened military officers stop what they were doing and read it twice. The signal reached Earth's military headquarters buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps. In a secure vault that required 3 different biometric scans to enter, servers that hadn't been activated since the last major war suddenly came online. Warning lights flashed red as an automated system began executing a protocol that military historians thought had been retired forever. Across human space, from the outer colonies to the core worlds, museum ships received the signal. These weren't just any old vessels, they were the survivors of humanity's bloodiest conflicts, ships that had earned their place in history by ending wars that threatened everything humans held dear. The USS Determined sat in Earth's orbital museum, its captain's chair empty for 50 years. The Starfire hung in a display dock above Mars, polished and perfect but missing its crew. The Iron Will orbited Jupiter, a monument to the soldiers who died defending the outer system. But now, for the first time in generations, these sleeping giants began to wake up. Admiral Rebecca Hayes ran her weathered fingers along the command console of the Relentless, feeling every dent and scratch that told the story of humanity's darkest hour. At 73, she thought her fighting days were over. The ship around her was supposed to be a museum piece, a reminder of the Centauri wars that had nearly destroyed human civilization 2 centuries ago. But museum pieces don't receive emergency activation codes. The bridge hummed to life around her as systems that had been dormant for decades began their startup sequences. Red emergency lights bathed everything in an ominous glow while technicians rushed between stations, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror. Nobody alive had seen these old warships in actual combat configuration. "Admiral, we're receiving confirmation signals from across the fleet," reported Lieutenant Casey Williams, a young officer who'd volunteered when word spread that the museum ships were being reactivated. Her hands shook slightly as she read from her display. "The Iron Fist is powering up over Europa. The Blood and Thunder just left Saturn's rings. Even the Nightmare is responding from the Pluto shipyards." Rebecca nodded grimly. The Nightmare was a ship so brutal in its design that it had been retired not because it was obsolete, but because it scared the politicians. Its captain had once used it to end a 3-year siege by simply showing up in orbit. The enemy had surrendered rather than face what that ship represented. "How many ships total?" Rebecca asked. 312 confirmed, Admiral. More are still coming online. The emergency protocol is pulling everything from the archives, battle cruisers from the Belt Wars, carriers from the Titan Offensive, even some experimental ships that were never supposed to see service again. The old admiral looked out at the stars through the reinforced viewing port. Somewhere out there, the Hegemony Coalition was attacking innocent people who'd asked for humanity's protection. They probably thought they were dealing with a simple rescue mission, maybe a few patrol boats and some local militia. They had no idea what they'd awakened. Across human space, the response was unlike anything seen in living memory. Veterans who'd been enjoying quiet retirement suddenly found themselves back in uniform. Commander Ryan Tucker had been running a small farm on New Texas when the call came. Now he stood on the bridge of the Defiant, a ship he'd served on as a young ensign 40 years ago. The muscle memory was still there, his hands found the controls without looking, his body moved through the familiar routines of preparing for war. In the Luna shipyards, engineers worked around the clock to bring ancient weapon systems online. These weren't the clean, efficient weapons of modern warfare. These were the brutal, overwhelming instruments that humanity had built when survival wasn't guaranteed. Plasma cannons that could crack planets, missile systems that fired thousands of warheads in coordinated swarms, kinetic weapons that turned asteroids into bullets. Young officers competed fiercely for positions aboard the museum ships. They'd grown up hearing stories about the legendary vessels, reading about battles in history books. Now they had a chance to serve alongside the heroes they'd idolized. Captain Brandon Foster, barely 30, found himself as weapons officer on the Stormbringer, working directly under veterans who'd actually fought in the wars he'd studied at the academy. Meanwhile, General Vorthak of the Hegemony Coalition was intercepting human communications and finding them amusing. His intelligence officers reported that Earth was activating old museum ships, relics from conflicts that had happened before his species had even developed spaceflight. His tactical computer estimated that human technology from that era was at least 3 generations behind Coalition standards. Ancient scrap metal, he told his staff officers as they reviewed the intercepts. Look at these ship classifications, some of them are over 200 years old. Their weapon systems are primitive, their armor is basic steel alloys, and their crews are either children or elderly veterans. We've crushed 17 civilizations with our modern fleet. These antiques won't even slow us down. Vorthak had built his reputation on overwhelming brutality. The Coalition way was simple: hit hard, hit fast, and leave nothing standing. It had worked against every species they'd encountered. The Trilaxians had fallen in 6 hours. The Morphic Collective had lasted 3 days before surrendering unconditionally. But General Vorthak had made a crucial miscalculation. He was judging these ships by their age rather than their purpose. Every vessel responding to the emergency call had earned its place in human history by doing one thing exceptionally well, winning wars that everyone said were unwinnable. The space around New Haven suddenly erupted with the brilliant flash of hyperspace exits. One by one, human warships materialized out of the void like ghosts returning from the dead. First came the massive dreadnoughts, their dark hulls scarred by centuries of warfare. Then the battle cruisers emerged, followed by carriers so large they cast shadows on the planet below. But this wasn't like any fleet the galaxy had ever seen before. These ships didn't match. They weren't uniform, sleek formations that modern military doctrine demanded. Instead, they were a patchwork of human military history spanning 300 years of evolution and survival. The Relentless led the formation, her hull telling a story of violence that made hardened coalition officers pause at their sensor stations. Massive gouges ran along her starboard side where Martian rebels had tried to crack her open with mining charges. Her forward armor bore the distinctive burn patterns of plasma weapons from a dozen different conflicts. Radiation scarring from fighting in the Corona Nebula had turned sections of her hull a strange purple color that no amount of repair work could fix. Beside her flew the Iron Fist, a ship so old she'd been built before humans had figured out artificial gravity. Her crew still worked in rotating sections, walking on walls that became floors as the ship spun through space. But her weapons were legendary, fusion torpedoes that could crack moons, kinetic railguns that fired projectiles at nearly the speed of light. The coalition sensors went crazy trying to identify what they were facing. Their computers had no classification for ships this old, no tactical data on weapons systems that predated their civilization's first spaceflight. Energy readings spiked off their charts as power plants designed for total war came online. These weren't the efficient, clean fusion reactors of modern ships, these were the brutal, overwhelming power sources that humanity had built when losing meant extinction. Commander Riley Johnson stood on the bridge of the Storm Chaser, watching coalition ships scramble to form defensive positions. His ship had fought in the Outer Rim Wars, where human colonies had been cut off from Earth for 20 years and had to survive on their own. Every system had been rebuilt at least twice, every weapon had been field-tested against enemies that wanted to wipe humanity from existence. "Look at them panic," he said to his weapons officer. "They've never seen ships like ours before." And they hadn't. Modern warfare was about precision strikes, minimal casualties, surgical operations designed to achieve political goals. But these ships came from an era when war meant one simple thing, the complete destruction of anything that threatened human survival. They'd been built by people who'd watched entire colonies burn, who'd seen friends and family murdered by alien invaders who showed no mercy. General Vorthak stood on his command ship, staring at the tactical display with growing unease. His intelligence officers were struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. Ships that should have been scrapped centuries ago were reading as fully operational combat vessels. Weapon signatures that predated their own species' technological development were powering up across the human formation. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, voice shaking slightly, "I'm reading energy levels that shouldn't be possible from ships this old. Some of these vessels are putting out more power than our entire fleet combined." That's when Admiral Hayes' voice cut through every communication frequency in the system. Her words were calm, measured, but carried a weight that made even coalition veterans take notice. "Coalition fleet, you have attacked civilians under human protection. You have 30 seconds to begin immediate withdrawal from this system, or we will consider you hostile combatants threatening non-combatants under our care." The bridge of Vorthak's flagship went silent. Around the system, coalition captains waited for their general's response. They'd crushed 17 civilizations through pure overwhelming force, but something about this human fleet felt different. These weren't the clean, modern warships they'd expected to face. These were something older, something that remembered when war wasn't about conquest but about survival. General Vorthak's response crackled across the comm channels, dripping with the contempt that had carried him through dozens of successful campaigns, weak humans playing protector to the helpless masses. "We've burned 17 worlds that thought they could stand against us. Your ancient museum pieces won't change anything. We'll crush you like we crushed all the others. The human fleet's response came not in words but in action. Weapon systems that had been dormant for decades suddenly came online. Gun ports opened along hulls that had survived humanity's darkest wars. And then Admiral Hayes' voice returned, colder than the void of space itself. General Vorthak, you just made the same mistake that 17 other species made when they threatened people under our protection. Those civilizations you mentioned? They're gone because they never learned what these ships represent. They're not museum pieces, General. They're reminders of what happens when you threaten what we protect. The Coalition fleet struck first, just as they had against 17 other civilizations. Their ships moved in perfect formation, unleashing coordinated salvos of plasma fire that had burned entire worlds to ash. It was a tactic that had never failed them, overwhelming firepower delivered with surgical precision to break enemy morale in the opening moments. But the human fleet didn't break. They didn't even flinch. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The ancient warships began to move like they were part of a single living organism. The Relentless rolled to starboard just as a plasma barrage passed through the space where she'd been seconds before. The Iron Fist dove beneath the formation, her weapons already tracking targets that the Coalition hadn't even fired at yet. It was like watching a deadly ballet performed by ships that weighed millions of tons. Commander Riley Johnson watched from the bridge of the Storm Chaser as Coalition fire passed harmlessly around his vessel. His helmsman, Lieutenant Torres, was flying patterns that had been developed during the siege of Europa, when human ships had to survive in a debris field for 6 months while under constant attack. How are they missing us? Torres called out over the sound of weapons fire. They're not missing, Johnson replied, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. We're just flying like our ancestors did when missing meant everyone dies. The Coalition had expected human ships to behave like modern military vessels, maintaining formation, following predictable attack patterns, engaging in the kind of organized warfare that had become standard across the galaxy. Instead, they found themselves fighting ships that moved like wild animals, each one seeming to know instinctively where enemy fire would be before it was even launched. The Relentless opened fire with weapons that made Coalition officers question their sensor readings. Her main guns were kinetic cannons designed to crack open heavily fortified positions during the Mars Rebellion. When they fired, they didn't shoot energy beams or plasma bolts. They fired solid metal slugs the size of buildings at speeds that turned them into pure destruction. The first salvo punched through a Coalition battlecruiser like it was made of paper, the projectile continuing on to damage 2 more ships behind it. Captain Brooks stood on the flight deck of the Iron Eagle, watching his pilots prepare for launch. These weren't the young hotshots that modern militaries preferred. These were veterans who'd volunteered to come out of retirement, men and women who'd learned to fly during humanity's most desperate conflicts. They climbed into fighters that were older than some civilizations, ships that had been rebuilt so many times that barely any original parts remained. Remember, people, Brooks announced over the squadron frequency, these Coalition pilots have never faced anything like what we're about to show them. They've been winning through superior technology and overwhelming numbers. Today, they meet superior experience. The first wave of human fighters launched into space, and Coalition pilots immediately knew they were in trouble. These ancient ships moved in ways that defied everything they'd been taught about space combat. They flew in formations that should have resulted in collisions, coordinated attacks without apparent communication, and seemed to know where enemy ships would be before they got there. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, flying a fighter that had survived the Battle of the Asteroid Fields, found herself facing 3 Coalition interceptors at once. In any normal engagement, she would have been outnumbered and outgunned. Instead, she did something that made the Coalition pilots freeze in confusion. She flew directly at the center ship while firing at the 2 on either side. By the time they realized what was happening, she'd destroyed both wingmen and the center pilot was too shocked to return fire effectively. The Coalition formation began to crumble as human tactics that had been refined over centuries of warfare proved their worth. Ships that had survived the darkest periods of human history weren't just fighting with superior weapons, they were fighting with the accumulated knowledge of every battle humanity had ever won against impossible odds. General Vorthak watched his tactical display in growing horror as his perfect formation fell apart. His ships were being picked off one by weapons and tactics he'd never encountered. Coalition vessels that had conquered star systems were being destroyed by human ships that should have been in museums. "What are these ships?" he screamed into his communicator as another of his cruisers exploded under fire from weapons that seemed to anticipate exactly where to hit for maximum damage. Admiral Hayes' voice cut through the chaos of battle, calm and deadly serious. "Every vessel in this fleet earned its place in history by ending wars that threatened innocent people. Today, they remember exactly how they did it." The silence that followed the battle was almost more terrifying than the fighting itself. Where moments before the space around New Haven had been filled with the flash of weapons fire and the screams of dying ships, now there was only the gentle drift of debris and the desperate electronic pleas of Coalition survivors begging for mercy. Captain Jake Morrison felt the ground stop shaking beneath his feet and knew the bombardment had ended. For the first time in hours, the deep mining tunnels were quiet except for the soft crying of children and the whispered prayers of refugees in a dozen different languages. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, human families who'd come to New Haven seeking a better life, Zolonian refugees who'd fled their homeworld civil war, crystal-based Lithians whose planet had been strip-mined to death, and even former Coalition prisoners who'd escaped and asked for sanctuary. "Is it over?" asked Dr. Linda Chen, the colony's chief medical officer, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake activated his communicator and tried to reach the surface. Static filled the channel for several seconds before a clear voice came through, but it wasn't Coalition. "New Haven Ground Control, this is Admiral Hayes aboard the UHS Relentless. The system is secure. Coalition forces have been neutralized. You may begin evacuation procedures from the tunnels." The relief that swept through the underground chambers was almost overwhelming. People began to cry, not from fear this time, but from the realization that they were going to survive. Jake helped organize the slow climb back to the surface, supporting elderly refugees and carrying children who were too exhausted to walk. When they finally emerged from the mine shafts, the sight that greeted them took everyone's breath away. The sky above New Haven was filled with ships, not the sleek, predatory vessels of the Coalition, but the massive, scarred hulls of humanity's ancient war fleet. The Relentless dominated the view, her hull telling the story of every battle she'd survived. Smaller human ships moved in patrol patterns while rescue vessels began the grim work of searching for Coalition survivors. But the real victory wasn't happening in orbit around New Haven. It was happening across the galaxy as the few Coalition ships that had managed to escape the battle carried word of what they'd witnessed to every corner of known space. Captain Willis Foster of the Coalition frigate Dark Triumph had watched the entire battle from the edge of the system, too far away to help but close enough to see everything. His ship's sensors had recorded the impossible. Human vessels over 2 centuries old had systematically destroyed a modern Coalition fleet using tactics and weapons that defied everything military strategists thought they knew about warfare. Now, as his ship limped toward Coalition space with a damaged engine and a crew traumatized by what they'd witnessed, Foster knew he was carrying the most important intelligence report in his species' history. The humans weren't just another conquest target. They were something far more dangerous, a species that would literally resurrect the ghosts of their most terrible wars to protect anyone who asked for their help. The message spread like wildfire through Coalition space and beyond. Within days, the story had reached every major civilization in the galaxy. Humanity hadn't just defended a single colony, they'd demonstrated something that changed the entire balance of power in known space. Admiral Hayes stood on the observation deck of the Relentless, watching as her fleet began preparations for the journey home. But not all the ships would be leaving. She'd already made the decision to establish a permanent garrison in the New Haven system, a mix of modern patrol vessels and carefully selected museum ships that would serve as a reminder to anyone who might consider threatening the refugees living there. Her personal log entry that night would become one of the most quoted passages in military history. The Coalition came here believing they could exterminate another helpless colony. What they discovered instead is a fundamental truth about humanity that every species eventually learns: we don't fight to conquer territory or expand our borders. We fight to ensure that anyone seeking protection under our flag can sleep peacefully at night. And there is no force in this galaxy more terrifying than humans who believe innocent people are in danger. The word spread to trading posts and diplomatic stations, to refugee camps and frontier colonies. Species that had never heard of humanity before suddenly knew their name. More importantly, they knew what that name meant: sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. The ancient ships had done more than win a battle. They'd sent a message that echoed across every star system in the galaxy: touch what humanity protects, and face the accumulated wrath of every war they've ever fought to defend the innocent. The galaxy had been listening. Now it understood.